there's a question that doesn't get asked nearly enough. When governments around the world borrow trillions upon trillions of dollars, when the total global debt reaches numbers so large they lose meaning, there's one question that should make everyone pause. Who exactly is getting paid? We talk about national debt as if it's an abstract concept, a number that exists somewhere disconnected from reality. Politicians debate it, economists forecast it, citizens worry about it, but here's what nobody explains. Every single dollar of that debt is owned by someone. Every bond issued has a buyer. Every treasury security sits in somebody's portfolio. And the answer to who owns all this debt reveals something far more interesting than the debt itself. It reveals a global financial architecture where money flows in circles, where the creditors are also the debtors, and where a surprisingly small number of institutions control claims on virtually all the wealth humanity produces. This isn't conspiracy. This is structure. And once you see who really owns the world's debt, you'll understand why the system can never be unwound, why it must keep growing, and why your role in this machine was decided long before you were born. Let's start with the sheer scale. As of late 2024, global debt reached approximately $318 trillion, according to the Institute of International Finance. That's not a typo. 318 trillion. To put that in perspective, the entire world economy, all goods and services produced by every country combined, totals roughly $111 trillion in 2024. We owe more than the planet produces by a staggering margin. This debt breaks into categories. Government debt, representing money borrowed by nations, hit approximately $102 trillion by 2024, according to UNCTAD data. Corporate debt, money borrowed by companies, stands at roughly $94 trillion. Household debt adds another $60 trillion. The numbers are so massive they become almost meaningless unless you understand who's holding the receipts. The United States leads the world in absolute debt levels. American government debt stands at roughly $37 to $38 trillion as of late 2025, and it's growing at an alarming pace. Between January 2024 and October 2025, the national debt increased from $34 trillion to $38 trillion, adding $4 trillion in less than 2 years. In October 2025 alone, the debt was growing at approximately $6 billion per day. But here's where it gets interesting. This debt isn't held by some mysterious entity hiding in the shadows. It's held by institutions you've probably heard of, countries whose names you know, and financial structures that touch your life whether you realize it or not. When people think about who owns government debt, especially American debt, they usually think of foreign countries. And they're partially right. Foreign nations hold enormous quantities of U.S. Treasury securities. As of December 2024, foreign countries held approximately $8.5 trillion in U.S. debt, representing roughly 30% of publicly held American debt. But that percentage has been declining steadily. Japan stands as the largest foreign holder, currently owning approximately $1.06 trillion as of December 2024. Japan has held this position for years, and the reason isn't complicated. When you run a massive trade surplus with the United States, meaning you sell far more goods to America than you buy, you accumulate enormous quantities of US dollars. Those dollars need to go somewhere. Japanese institutions park that money in U.S. treasuries because they're considered the safest investment on earth. China used to be the largest foreign holder but has been steadily reducing its position. As of December 2024, China holds approximately $759 billion in U.S. treasuries, down from over $1 trillion just a few years ago. This reduction sparked endless speculation about China weaponizing debt holdings. But the reality suggests China's economy has slowed and authorities have needed dollars for domestic purposes. The United Kingdom ranks third, holding roughly $723 billion. But this number is somewhat misleading. A large portion of UK holdings likely represents investments flowing through London's financial centre rather than the British government itself. Luxembourg, Canada, the Cayman Islands, Belgium, and other financial centers show up as massive holders, not because their citizens are buying treasuries, but because investment flows are routed through these jurisdictions. Here's what matters. While foreign ownership sounds dramatic, these countries don't actually control US debt markets. They can't weaponize their holdings effectively because there's always another buyer. Foreign nations buy treasuries not to gain leverage over America, but because they have no better alternative for managing their foreign exchange reserves. Now we get to the institutions that actually dominate debt ownership. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, has played an extraordinary role. While the Fed has been reducing its balance sheet through quantitative tightening, it still holds trillions in U.S. government securities. At its peak, following COVID quantitative easing, the Fed's balance sheet swelled to nearly $9 trillion. As of 2024, it had reduced to approximately $7.4 trillion through gradual runoff. This process, called quantitative easing, became the Fed's primary tool after the 2008 financial crisis. Between 2008 and 2014, the Fed conducted multiple rounds of asset purchases. Then came 2020. When COVID hit, the Fed created over $4 trillion in just 2 years to purchase treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. Think about that. The central bank typed numbers into computers, creating money that didn't exist, and used that money to buy government bonds. The Federal Reserve isn't alone. The European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, Bank of England all conducted massive quantitative easing programs. Central banks collectively bought trillions in government and corporate debt. They now sit on enormous holdings, effectively monetizing government deficits. But central banks are only one piece. The real story involves institutions that manage money on behalf of millions of ordinary people. Pension funds represent one of the largest institutional holders of government debt worldwide. These funds manage retirement savings for teachers, firefighters, corporate employees, government workers. They hold massive amounts of government bonds because regulations require it, and because they need safe assets that generate predictable returns, matching future obligations. In OECD countries, central bank holdings of domestic sovereign bonds fell from 29% of total outstanding debt in 2021 to 19% in 2024, while domestic households grew from 5% to 11%, and foreign investors increased from 29% to 34%. This shift reveals how debt ownership is redistributing. Insurance companies follow a similar pattern. They need stable, long-duration assets to match future claims. Regulations allow them to hold less capital against government bonds than against other investments, effectively incentivizing bond purchases. State and local governments and their pension funds also hold substantial U.S. debt, managing proceeds from municipal bond issuances in compliance with federal tax laws. Mutual funds represent another massive holder. These investment vehicles pool money from individual investors and buy portfolios of securities. Bond mutual funds, money market funds, balanced funds all hold government securities as core portfolio components. Commercial banks hold treasuries for liquidity requirements and as collateral for various transactions. But there's a category of institutional investors that deserves special attention. 3 firms dominate asset management globally: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. BlackRock manages approximately $13.5 trillion. Vanguard oversees roughly $8 trillion. State Street controls about $4 trillion. Combined, these 3 firms manage over $25 trillion. They don't own debt in the traditional sense. They manage money on behalf of investors, primarily through index funds. But the scale of assets under their management gives them unprecedented influence. When you invest in a Vanguard bond fund, that fund buys treasuries and corporate bonds in proportion to market indices. Given the size of government debt markets, these index funds hold enormous quantities of treasuries. These firms show up as major holders across virtually every asset class. They're major shareholders in every large corporation. They're major holders of treasury securities, corporate bonds, mortgage-backed securities, the full spectrum. Their concentration creates fascinating dynamics. The big 3 account for approximately 74% of the entire equity ETF market, with similar dominance in bond funds. Here's what makes this structure unusual. These firms don't own the assets they manage. The money belongs to teachers with retirement accounts, retirees with savings, university endowments, pension plans. But legal ownership versus control creates an important distinction. The investors own the underlying securities. The asset managers control when they're traded and how voting rights are exercised. That control translates to power. Now let's step back and look at the complete picture. Who really owns the world's debt? The answer is a network. Governments borrow from central banks, which create money to buy bonds. Pension funds and insurance companies buy government debt to match liabilities and satisfy regulations, meaning your future retirement depends on governments making interest payments. Mutual funds and ETFs, managed by the big 3, hold treasuries and corporate bonds on behalf of millions of individual investors. Foreign governments buy debt with trade surplus dollars generated from selling goods to deficit countries. Banks hold government debt as liquidity reserves while simultaneously borrowing from central banks. Corporations issue bonds that pension funds buy, while those same corporations hold treasury securities. The system is thoroughly interconnected, with every major institution simultaneously owning debt and owing debt. When the U.S. government makes interest payments on its debt, where does that money go? Interest payments consume approximately $880 billion annually as of 2025, more than the cost of Medicare or national defense. That money flows to Japan's central bank, to Chinese institutions, to pension funds managing retirement savings, to mutual fund shareholders, to insurance companies, to the Federal Reserve, which then remits most of it back to Treasury. This matters because debt holders aren't a separate class. They're pension funds managing your retirement, insurance companies covering your policies, mutual funds in your savings account. You pay taxes that fund interest payments to institutions that manage money on your behalf. You simultaneously owe and are owed. The system is entirely circular. The same pattern repeats globally. Japan's government debt exceeds 200% of GDP. Who owns it? Primarily the Bank of Japan, Japanese pension funds, insurance companies, domestic banks. Foreign ownership is minimal. China's debt situation involves state-owned banks buying government bonds, meaning the government effectively borrows from itself through state-controlled institutions. Here's the uncomfortable truth this reveals. There is no them who owns all the debt. There's only us, arranged in different institutional configurations. Your pension fund owns treasuries issued to cover deficits that may have included your benefits. You paid taxes that funded interest payments to mutual funds you own. The creditor and debtor are the same people, filtered through institutional layers. The system works as long as confidence holds. As long as everyone believes debts will be serviced, that interest will be paid, that principal will be rolled over rather than repaid, the machine runs smoothly. Government issues debt. Institutions buy it. Interest payments flow. New debt finances old obligations, but the machine has failure modes. The average interest rate on all outstanding federal debt has more than doubled, rising from 1.556% in January 2022 to 3.352% as of July 2025. Rising rates make servicing debt exponentially more expensive. The Congressional Budget Office expects annual interest payments to reach $1.8 trillion by 2035, totaling $13.8 trillion over the next decade. If interest rates spike further, governments face impossible choices between default, inflation, or crushing austerity. If major institutional holders need to sell during a crisis, finding buyers becomes difficult. If foreign holders lose confidence and dump treasuries simultaneously, though where they'd park trillions remains unclear, market instability could follow. The current trajectory is unsustainable by definition. Debt grows faster than GDP globally. Interest payments consume increasing shares of government budgets. The pattern suggests something must eventually give, whether through accelerated growth, which seems unlikely given aging demographics, or through adjustment nobody wants to contemplate. The institutions that own global debt understand these risks. That's why central banks are accumulating gold at the fastest pace in decades, despite publicly dismissing its monetary role. That's why pension funds diversify into alternative assets. That's why the wealthy hold real property and productive assets beyond paper claims. The final truth is that the question, who owns the world's debt, has an answer that should disturb anyone who thinks carefully. We own it. All of us. Through pension funds, insurance policies, mutual funds, savings accounts, we're simultaneously the debtors and creditors. We owe ourselves. The government borrowed on our behalf and sold that debt to institutions managing our savings. We pay taxes to service debt held in our retirement accounts. The beneficiaries aren't foreign powers or shadowy cabals. They're pension funds that owe us retirement income, insurance companies that owe us benefits, and financial institutions connecting savers to borrowers. The costs show up as taxes, inflation, and a perpetual treadmill where debt must grow to service existing debt. Understanding who owns the world's debt reveals that modern finance has created a system where everyone is simultaneously creditor and debtor, where money circulates in loops, where obligations can never be fully repaid, only rolled forward, and where the endgame requires either perpetual growth or adjustment nobody discusses. If this gave you a different perspective on debt and who actually holds the world's IOUs, hit that subscribe button. The story of who owns what and why they can never let go continues unfolding, and understanding the structure is the first step towards seeing what comes next.